Good morning, everybody. Welcome to B4 Live. I'm Richard Rosser. And this morning, we welcome Tom Cheesewright. Tom, are you there?
Good morning.
He is. Look at that. Isn't that the most organised, disorganised garage you've ever seen in your life? I'm assured by Tom it's either side of the camera. It's an absolute horror show, but looks very organised to me.
Yeah, well, it keeps me busy.
I first met Tom a couple of years ago. I think Freeth got you along to do a couple of talks, and we had a dinner at Pembroke, which was very entertaining. I can't remember you mentioning coronavirus once, but I'm sure you had some sort of inkling, and you were saying off camera that in your new book you do make reference to it.
There's a passing mention in there, absolutely. But as I shall come on to explain, the preparations for coronavirus are very similar to the preparations for other things.
So, man from the future, when are we coming out of lockdown? That's the big question.
Well, I judge this by when can I go back to the pub, and I'm the most pessimistic amongst my friends, some of whom are in rather better positions to predict this than me, and I say 28th of August, but some people saying
sounds
September,
very specific.
So, yeah, well, we had to put a specific date in for the sweepstakes, so.
Oh, great. Well, we're really privileged to have you here this morning. Your first day of missing the Joe Wicks workout, I understand.
Yeah, absolutely. I managed to squeeze in the first few minutes, but I decided I'd better not do this in my jogging bottoms. So I even put on a shirt for you.
Well, thank God for that. Over to you, Tom. Thank you. And if there's any questions, anybody will put in the chat. If you've got any questions for Tom, we'll come to those at the end. Yes, Tom, after you finish your presentation?
Absolutely, yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, over to you.
So if I can just bring up Zoom, and I can do share screen and bring up this slide deck. You should all be able to now see the first slide.
Yes, we've got that, yep.
Brilliant. So what I'm going to talk about today are some of the key points from my new book, Future Proof Your Business. This book was meant to be launched at the end of July. And when everything happened around coronavirus and the lockdown, Penguin, my publisher, rang me up and said, we're thinking of bringing forward the launch because we think this is very relevant to what's happening. And I said, great, when are we going to bring it forward to? And they said Tuesday. And this was on a Thursday afternoon. And so it's been a very, very accelerated launch. But I think they're right. I think so many of the lessons in this book are really important in this time. And they're important from a practical perspective, and I'll talk through three of the big sort of critical tips from the book in terms of building sustainable success, building a future-proof and resilient business. But I think they're really important as well from a philosophical point of view. And underpinning the whole book, even though it's a very practical book, is really a suggestion of a shift in philosophy about how we build business, how we run business. That's also applicable, very applicable, I think, to actually how we run government and local authorities and things as well. So to kick off, I want to talk a bit about that philosophy, that shift in philosophy. And as Richard said, I've been doing the Joe Wicks every morning, as a lot of people have with my kids. And so it seemed appropriate to refer back to Joe here. In fact, I actually found footage of me and Joe Wicks on the short-lived Channel 5 Saturday show from about 2016 the other day. Yeah, his trajectory's been slightly different. But this whole thing about being lean, you know, when I talk to businesses, when I read the literature about business, when you go and read business books from the last sort of 40 years, 50 years, so much of it has been about making our businesses lean. It's been about optimization. It's been about efficiency. It's been about how can we do a little bit better tomorrow than we did yesterday, but still doing fundamentally the same things. You know, how can we save a bit of cost? How can we increase our profits? How can we increase our revenue? But again, coming back to optimizing the things we already do. And this has done a lot of good. It's been the recipe for success for a lot of businesses. You know, I work with people like BMW, whose success was built on continuous process optimization, continually doing better and better at the things they already did well. But my argument in the book, and this philosophical shift that underpins the book for me, is it's not good enough anymore. We can't rely on optimization to continue to drive success, particularly over the long term. And the reason is that the nature of our world has shifted. And as I point out in my first book, High Frequency Change, you know, lots of businesses that have been very stable, industries that have been very stable and grown year on year through this process of continuous optimization are now being utterly disrupted and transformed by these waves of high frequency change. And that book was an attempt to explain this sense that so many of us have, that things are accelerating now, that the world is changing faster, and square that with the reality that, you know, I'm sat in a 140-year-old house. Lots of things clearly don't change very fast at all. And my argument was that inside individual industries, because of this hyper-connected world we live in, both digitally and physically, albeit less so at the moment, means, products, ideas, media move incredibly quickly around the world and can blast through industries. Like the friction, a lot of the friction's been taken out of innovation. And so even if you've been doing something successfully for 50 years and getting better and better at it, overnight something new can come along and utterly disrupt your business. And in fact, in many ways, the more optimized your business is for a particular discipline, the harder it's going to be to transform. So fundamental to this new book, Future-Proof Your Business, is this philosophy that actually, if we want to build sustainable success, if we want to build a business that's not just going to be really high growth and really profitable for the next 2 years, but there's still going to be around supplying our customers, providing us with an income, or actually supporting our descendants, our family, the people we sold the business to in 20 years' time, still have a good reputation in 20 years' time, then we've got to fundamentally shift our focus from constant optimization to adaptation. And that has some really big implications for how we behave, how we operate, and actually even how we structure our businesses. So the first thing to say about that is, excuse me, to shift into the tools aspect of the book, is when I've been a full-time futurist now for 8 years. Before that, it was an interest and a hobby that I was writing and broadcasting about. But in the last 8 years, I've worked with an enormous range of organizations, including, you know, local authorities, bits of central government, and some of the world's largest companies. I work with about 25 of the global 500 now. And over that time, what I've done is develop a kit of tools to help those clients answer the questions that they ask me. But also I've learned from them along the way. And I can really break that toolkit down into 3 parts. Excuse me. And those 3 parts for me really map very closely to those traits you see that differentiate great athletes from normal human beings like you and me. You know, even after 3-4 weeks of doing Joe Wicks, I would certainly not consider myself in any way really athletic. But these great athletes have some things they can do. The first thing, they have great senses. They have this incredible strategic sense to read the game, and also this really immediate sense, this sort of proprioception for what's going on in their immediate environment. And they process that information really well. They pull information in from what they see about the game and from what's happening around them, and they take decisions really, really quickly. And the third thing they do is they train. They train and train and train for the game that they're in. And that game changes all the time. You know, the state of the Premier League now is very, very different to the state of the First Division 30 years ago. And a First Division player from 30 years ago might really struggle in the Premier League now, based on the nature of the training that they have to do. And the same is true of our businesses. We have to be fit for the business we're in, not for the business that we were in yesterday. So let me break these down in a bit more detail. The first thing I talk about, one of the first things I talk about in the book, is about actually these senses. How do you build better senses for your organization? And really, being a futurist, that's about how we look at the future. And so when I came into this business full time, lots of clients were coming to me and asking me, what does the future look like for us? And I went and looked at all the sort of tools of futurism that were out there. And amazingly, there are lots of tools of futurism. It's a fairly well-established discipline. You can even go and study it at university. But all those tools were designed to help people understand what might happen in 25 years. There was very little that said, what's going to happen in the next 2 to 5? And those are the questions that clients were coming to me with. They didn't want to know, are we going to have jetpacks in the 2050s? They wanted to know, what's going to take me out of the knees in the next 5 years? What's going to turn me into the next Kodak, turn me into the next Blockbuster? And so the first thing I did was build a methodology that said, how do we look at the near future? And how do we do it in a practical manner, in an amount of time that actually an executive can give up? Because, you know, working on the business rather than in the business is a perennial problem for all of us who run small, medium, or even large businesses. And so what I came to is I said, look, if you look back at all these big changes that have transformed and disrupted these businesses that were doing this great steady state and then rapidly got transformed and disrupted, they were all facing pressure points that were already in their organizations, already in their industries. And the first thing you do is go and find those pressure points. Go and talk to your peers, go and talk to your customers, go and talk to your advisors. Best of all, talk to everybody at every layer in your business and find out what causes them problems, what causes them headaches, what disappoints them, what slows them down, what stops them being productive. And build this list of the pressure points that you're already facing. And then go out and look at the macro trends, the trends that are changing everything around you. Go and read the FT, go and read your industry titles. Again, go and talk to the analysts in your industry, go and speak to your industry associations and look at what those macro trends are. And I list 5 key ones in the book that I sort of constantly track. What you find is where those big macro trends collide with the pressure points that you're already facing, you start to identify some very rapid transformations that might happen, and you can start to prepare for them. What I tell people to do is spend one day every 6 months, which is roughly 1% of your time, one day every 6 months, break out of the business, use this methodology, look for your pressure points, look at the trends, do some reading, look where the two collide. Pick 5 things and add them to your to-do list for the next 6 months. Address those 5 things where those items collide, where the trends collide with the pressure points. Fix them over the next 6 months. Repeat the process then, and just keep that going. So a constant cycle of innovation, development, and adaptation. Now, it's no good having that foresight, being able to see what's coming if you can't do anything about it. Another thing I found, again, with working with organizations of all different shapes and sizes, is that there's incredible levels of sclerotic bureaucracy that stop people making decisions quickly. We're very, very bad at responding rapidly to these things when we see them. And so I try and work with my clients to accelerate the flow of information through the business. And we talk about streamlining processes. We talk about who works where. We talk about investing in technology to move information faster. And those are all really good things, all really useful things you can do, and actually quite often a lot cheaper than you think they are. But there's something actually much cheaper, much more succinct, much more successful in the long run that you can do to accelerate decisions in the business. And it's about delegation. The most future-ready businesses push power to the edge of the organization so that people at the edge, people who are experiencing those pressure points, can take decisions quickly. And I actually give a really good example of this in my last book. It's a story from Lidl around the launch of One Direction Easter eggs. A few years ago, when Lidl wasn't quite the brand name it was and the sort of normal supermarket it was, they didn't have many branded goods. But they rolled out this line of One Direction Easter eggs around this time, sort of 4 or 5 years ago, just at the time when, and I'm sorry if this is triggering for anybody, Zayn left One Direction. And so they're stuck with these Easter eggs with the 5 members of the band on the picture and only 4 members in the band. And this news comes in through their social media manager, who turns to their merchandising manager and says, look, we've got a problem. Zayn's left One Direction. And the merchandising manager sort of dries his tears and says, do you know what? We can deal with this. 1/5 of the band's gone. We'll knock 1/5 of the price off. And the social media manager goes, great, I can work with that, and puts out this sort of social media message which gets huge traction from all these weeping One Direction fans. And what's incredible about that story is that the whole process took just 20 minutes for this enormous commercial decision. And it was a decision made between 2 people in the sort of early 20s who'd been given the responsibility and the autonomy to take those decisions, but importantly, the skills and the boundaries they knew within which they could work. So you can accelerate flow of information. I absolutely recommend it. But if you can look at pushing power to the edge of your organization, so much the better. Now, the third thing I recommend that people do in the book, and this is probably the hardest one to get your head around, but in many ways, I think actually the most important. And it's about that fitness. It's about that training your organization for the changes that might come. As part of these sort of decades of optimization that we've been through, this constant effort and focus on making our businesses as efficient as possible, we've tended to make them quite monolithic, quite integrated. We've taken away all the sort of excess cost in terms of, what might have looked like fat under a previous discipline. And we've brought everybody as close together as possible so that people are sort of hyper-connected. You've got lots of people working very, very closely in order to fulfill a goal. And that's no good in a situation like this. What you really want when you want to transform quickly is actually a bit of fat in the system, so people have got the bandwidth to go and do some additional thinking. Maybe they've done some additional thinking in the past. But what you really want instead of this monolith is this box of Lego bricks that you can dynamically reassemble to face new and different challenges. And the best way I can explain this is actually by using this Lego analogy. And this is a slide I originally did for one of my clients, Audi, when I was doing some leadership training for them. If you imagine 2 toy cars that you give to your child on their birthday or at Christmas, and you give them a die-cast toy Audi Quattro, fire up the Quattro, and if you're lucky, they're going to be really entertained by it, by somewhere between an hour a day, a week, or even a month. But at the end of that period, it's only ever going to be a die-cast Audi Quattro. Now, it's perfectly optimized. It's a perfectly optimized model. It looks just like the thing it's trying to be. There's no excess, there's no fat. It's perfectly what it is. But it's utterly inflexible unless you're willing to get out the super glue and the angle grinder. Now, compare that to the Lego Audi Quattro on the other side. Let's be honest, it doesn't look a lot like an Audi Quattro. There's knobbly bobbly bits everywhere. It's all a little bit misshapen. It's recognizable, but it's not efficient. It's not optimized. But the great thing about the Lego Audi Quattro is when the time for change comes, when the child gets bored with the Audi Quattro, when your customers get bored with that proposition, you can rip it apart and reassemble it to be something new. It can be a dragon or a dinosaur or a unicorn or a transformer, or whatever you want it to be. And what I'm trying to do is encourage organizations to say, do you know what? Let's look at our organization not as a single whole, but as a network of loosely coupled pieces, each one of which fulfills a function. We've got a really strong finance team. We've got a really strong procurement team. We've got a really good product design team. We've got a really good sales team. Look at the interfaces between them and make sure that information flows smoothly. And they say, do you know what? That sales team, they don't just have to sell our Audi Quattro. We could sell other things as well that are adjacent to that. Our procurement team, they're really good. Why are they only doing procurement for us? Our finance team, actually, do we need a full-time finance team, or could we outsource some of that instead? And instead of constructing this organization from a completely wholly owned set of deeply integrated blocks, we build our organizations from a network of components that can either supply exclusively us, components that might be from elsewhere, or components that actually could provide great services to other people alongside providing services to us if there's excess capacity. And the company that really understood this earliest, that really got this about 15, 16 years ago, was Amazon. Love them or hate them for whatever reason, Amazon is an incredibly resilient business. It's not as profitable as it could be. And for a long time, Amazon was beaten up by the markets for not being profitable enough. And the reason is that for 15 or 16 years, they've been investing in this overhead of agility. About 16 years ago, Jeff Bezos sent out a memo to everybody in the organization and said, stop talking to each other. He said, break the organization down into these functional blocks, wrap them all in a layer of software that defines how you talk to each other, and then see if each one of those blocks could actually provide a service through that layer of software to people outside the organization. And one of those blocks was Amazon Web Services, the largest cloud hosting company in the world now, but formerly just an IT function of Amazon as a retailer. And for me, that's an incredibly compelling vision. It says if you want to be resilient, if you want to survive these shocks, break your organization into these functional blocks that can be rapidly reassembled, that allow you to bolt new blocks on to meet new opportunities really fast. Or if you have to be ruthless, drop individual blocks without disrupting the whole organization. But also allow those blocks to be entrepreneurial, push power out to those blocks and allow them to do interesting things and innovate on your behalf. So those are really the four lessons I wanted to cover. The first one being about this philosophy. We're in an age now where adaptation, not optimization, is the sort of the primary goal, should be the primary goal of leadership. And I think the coronavirus pandemic has really just illustrated that, because all of the preparations that you might have made for disruption in your own narrow industry or sector, for me, are exactly the same preparations that you might make for a global disruption like this pandemic, which has shifted all of our perspectives and maybe accelerated a few trends that we came across. So that shift in philosophy for me is really important. It's not an easy one. It has costs. If you're a small or micro business, building the time and the possibility of being adaptable is really hard when you're clamoring for every bit of revenue, and I've been there. But as you start to grow and build, I really think that ought to be in your mindset. How do I build an adaptable business much more than I build one that's perfectly optimized for what I do today? Because the chances are what you do today might either be disrupted by something like this pandemic, or might be disrupted by your customers shifting a new product or service, a new entrant from abroad. And if you're going to do that, there's really three lessons. If you're going to build that resilient, adaptable business, first of all, build your senses. Ensure that you're closely connected to the customer in the market and devote 1% of your time to seeing what's coming using that toolkit I talked through. The second one is to accelerate your decision making. Ensure that you can process this information quickly and turn it around into a decision. The best way to do that is to push power to the edge of the organization. And the third thing you need to do is make sure the shape of your organization is appropriate, that it's a box of Lego bricks that can be dynamically reassembled rather than that tightly integrated die-cast car that's much more difficult to change. So all of that's in this book. It's out now on Kindle. It won't be out until 30th of July, which was the originally planned launch date in paperback, but it'll be in all the shops then. And if you are interested, want to grab a copy, there's a link there, bit.ly/futureproofbook, and you can go and grab a copy. And that's me done with my slides, Richard.
Thank you very much, Tom. Brilliant. Good stuff. We've got Dave Richards. If you'd like to come on screen, you've got a question for Tom.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can now, Dave. Yeah, thank you.
Good. Hi. Morning.
Good morning.
Very interesting presentation, and I think particularly in this time of unprecedented, it's a new word, change in the business environment. My question is about the current leadership of organisations, because generationally I've experienced that they come from a more command and control, risk-averse environment rather than a more empowered risk-taking approach. And I was just wondering, how do you get the leadership of an organisation to take your sensing, responding and more collaborative model seriously, as it feels as if it's contradictory to the way they like to run businesses?
So I'm quite lucky in that the organisations that call me are generally already starting to think in that direction. And so the really big organisations that I deal with, quite often the chief exec has already bought into that vision or some version of it. They usually have their own version of that approach. And the problem is shifting the culture for everybody else, because we've all been raised pretty much in that command and control environment. You know, that's where most of us grew up in business. That's how things were done. So you've not just got to achieve this sort of culture shift in the leadership. Sometimes that's already there. You've got to achieve this culture shift across the business. And that's why it's slow. I mean, that's why it's difficult. And what I'm generally finding is that the catalyst for this is when people realize they have no choice. And so, you know, if a great example is BMW. You know, BMW, I spoke at the launch of their new leadership development program last year. You know, BMW was a prime example of an organization that has thrived on command and control, but also continuous optimization. You know, we're just going to do better next year than what we did last year. And what they've realized now in the rapidly changing automotive environment, that's not good enough anymore. And so they're now teaching all of their leaders this concept of ambidextrous leadership, that you've got to have the responsibility, not just for keeping things going, but actually innovating and being entrepreneurial and doing all these things as well. And so, you know, I think, you know, culture change is really hard. It generally comes with a shock. You know, the ideal is that we can change it beforehand and convince people. And really the only way I've found to do that is to show them the reality of their peers, to tell them stories about, look, this organization in an adjacent industry thought like you, thought they could continue with business as usual, thought their industry was different and wasn't going to be disrupted. And here in detail, in depth, is the story of how that went horribly wrong, because they didn't do these things in advance of the shock coming, and they weren't agile enough to respond when it did. But I'll be honest, it's really difficult. It's the most difficult part of the job, is not just getting leadership to make that culture change. Whereas, as I say, quite often it's leadership who want to drive it, but they struggle with the fact that everybody else in their organization has been brought up in this command and control environment.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what you made an interesting point as well, that actually the situation we're in at the moment will actually accelerate some of the trends and patterns that have already been happening over time. So, for example, you know, I used WebEx back in 1998 to do a call where actually I was in London, the client was in Germany, and the person who was directing the demonstration was in the States. And yet, how many years later, 20 years later, suddenly Zoom becomes the latest new thing. And I'm thinking, this is actually quite old technology. And I think it's because people have seen it as being second best. What I find interesting, that perhaps in the future, it'll become the first choice rather than the second choice. And and there's some benefits for that, for the economy, cost of sales, the environment. You know, I think some of these trends that we've seen coming, you know, more social value coming into businesses, all that will accelerate. And that's what I find really interesting.
It's really interesting. I'm already seeing people complaining on Twitter that not every call has to be a video call. And so people are like using Zoom as preference to just picking up the telephone now. But the point about acceleration is a really important one, I think. You know, lots of people ask me about, you know, what has changed as a result of coronavirus. And actually, I can't see anything that's entirely new. It's all acceleration of existing trends. We were already moving towards more flexible work. We were already using sort of video calling slowly more and more. Yes, it's accelerated those trends, but I don't see that it's created anything entirely new. It's just bumped progress along a little bit faster than might have been expected.
I think what may be new is people's attitudes. I think that may be the thing, that people who have been very antipathetic about using technology are now being forced to use it and actually realizing that it can be useful to them. And I think that will be the change, because suddenly, where they were able to push back against it, they can't anymore, because it's the way you have to do business. I think you're right. I think the trends will continue. I think the subtlety of the change will be in people's behaviours as a result of this change.
I'm fully expecting a backlash against that, though. As soon as people can get off technology, the opportunity to go and do things physically, face to face, we'll see a huge resurgence in that again. It'll feel like a premium value again.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thanks very much. It was very interesting. Tom, is there I'm not sure the right way to ask this question. I've talked to a lot of people who are having back-to-back Zoom calls, and at the end of the day, they're feeling pretty knackered and burnt out. Yet there's another part of the population which isn't getting involved in doing any sort of work at all, that might be furloughed, that might be enjoying the break away from work. Is that going to knit back together those two parts of society, or can you see that being a sort of a permanent stake in the ground where there is a shift from those that aren't currently working? That I don't know. What's the impact of that? Not really sure what I'm asking, but you know what I mean.
I think I think there is a sort of interesting fragmentation happening, where those who are, like you say, sort of hyper connected digitally, who can continue working digitally and remotely, are remaining a sort of fairly well connected to this world, where lots of people are actually much more isolated. It's interesting the role that social media is playing in actually bridging those gaps. My Twitter feed now is a very great mix of those sort of journalists, politicians, technologists who are entirely capable of carrying on what they were doing remotely, and people working for charities or in events or in other sectors who absolutely who've been furloughed and who aren't able to carry on, but are using social media to maintain that connection and that relationship, to draw on support, to seek connection. And I think the group we have to be worried about are the ones who didn't have those existing digital relationships. How do we bring those people into the fold? And I've spent a lot of time on local radio recently, explaining to people how to use, Zoom, Skype, WhatsApp, all of these things, reassuring people about, giving people some confidence in the security and privacy aspects of them, which, there's been a lot of scares about, because I think they're so critical at the moment. I think they're so important. I still think they're a poor second best to meeting, shaking hands, sharing food, breaking bread. But they're at least something. There's some form of human contact. In terms of that fragmentation, how we knit that back together, I am fully expecting a snap back when the lockdown ends, a real reaction to this isolation. I think there's probably going to be a baby boom while we're all isolated. There's probably be another one when it's all over. But all of the sort of the less sort of sexually charged aspects to that as well. I think a real renaissance in going out, clubs, pubs, restaurants, events, face-to-face networking, handshaking. And as I say, I think it becomes it's something that we really put a premium on. Maybe 80% of our relationships increasingly digital, but that 20% is something we really, really value. We just have to make sure we pull as many people into it as possible.
It's interesting you say that. I was talking to a client yesterday who's got contacts in their supply chain in China, and they've been saying, you'll know this better than I, that apparently it's not the done thing to sit at your desk during lunch in China. Everybody goes out to lunch to a restaurant or to a bar. And in the first week when they went back to work, people did bring their lunch in, but within a week, everybody was back in the restaurants and the bars. Okay, with caution.
Sure.
But they reverted to type pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I'm fully expecting that here as well. I think there will be some hangovers. I think there will be some enforced changes. We're going to have new legislation. We're going to have perhaps a cautiousness about public transport. We might see a resurgence in car sales, ironically. There'll obviously be some new sort of health and safety measures in the workplace. But and obviously there's going to be some businesses that fail as well, and that's going to enforce some change as well. But for the most part, sort of behaviorally, culturally, I think plus or minus 5%, we kind of snap back to where we were.
Okay, I mean, you pretty well just covered it, but final question from Colin. What will the business world look like in 12 months' time, in a nutshell?
I think it looked very much like it did, 6 months ago. I think we'll see, resurgence in most economies. I think we'll see some sectors which we've seen a boost through this time, grow and maintain some of that growth, not to the same extent. We have to look at someone like Zoom, who's now currently delivering, bearing a lot of cost for free, effectively, in return for supporting all of these calls. I mean, they're taking some, probably an increase in revenue as well, but probably nowhere near as much as they're spending. So I think a lot of the business worlds look the same. I think there's obviously a lot of entrepreneurship. I think maybe there's an acceleration in the growth of the gig economy and freelancing. I think we see some companies starting to think more flexibly and about how they do build in resilience and response to situations like this. But fundamentally, I think it'll look very, very familiar in 12 months' time.
Interesting. Brilliant, Tom. Really appreciate your time, and good luck with the book. And we'll, with your permissions, share the slides with everybody on the call today, together with the copy of the video, and contact details. Brilliant, Tom. And thank you. You've also agreed to speak at Bio in June. So we look forward to seeing you then.